Today lived March 2, 2021. World News Headlines. U.S. Senators scurry to refine Biden's $1.9 trillion COVID-19 aid ahead of vote. U.S. Supreme Court leans toward upholding Republican-backed voting curbs. No evidence U.S. Capitol rioters belong to Antifa movement. FBI Chief Wray testifies. The governor of New York weakened by the accusations of a third woman. Nicolas Sarkozy denounces a deep injustice. The Dominican Republic wants to build a wall of separation with Haiti. Ivanka Trump short-circuited by her brother Donald Trump Jr. New dynamics within the clan. Blinken speaks with Ethiopian leader about human rights concerns in Tigray. Jack Ma loses title as China's richest man after coming under Beijing's scrutiny. China says door to Xinjiang always open, but UN rights boss should not prejudge. Beijing dismisses alleged Chinese hacking of Indian vaccine makers. Exclusive. Venezuelan intelligence monitored Citgo executives in U.S. court testimony. U.S. understanding is Myanmar ambassador to UN remains in position, State Department. Sarkozy says he is ready to sue France before European court to prove innocence. Myanmar's neighbors press junta for Suu Kyi's release, restoration of democracy. U.S. Senators scurry to refine Biden's $1.9 trillion COVID-19 aid ahead of vote. Washington negotiations over President Joe Biden's $1.9 trillion COVID-19 relief bill go into overdrive this week as the U.S. Senate begins debate over the sweeping legislation and lawmakers jockey to include pet projects such as broadband connectivity. Senator Angus King, an independent who aligns with Democrats, has been pushing for billions of dollars to expand high-speed broadband service in rural areas, an idea that could attract Republican support. The Senate was due to take up as early as Wednesday the measure passed last weekend by the House of Representatives. Democratic senators were privately discussing among themselves and with Biden ways to reallocate at least some of the huge pot of money. The version of the bill passed by the House would pay for vaccines and medical supplies and send a new round of emergency financial aid to households, small businesses and state and local governments. It includes $1,400 direct payments to individuals, a $400 per week federal unemployment benefit through August 29, and help for those having difficulty paying rents and home mortgages during the pandemic. The Senate version is likely to include at least one major change, eliminating a minimum wage increase to $15 per hour over 5 years from its current $7.25. Late last week, the effort was blocked under special rules designed to ease passage of this legislation in the Senate. Democrats are expected to resuscitate their minimum wage initiative sometime after the COVID-19 bill is enacted. Congress is trying to give final approval to Biden's top legislative priority as the pandemic already has taken the lives of 514,000 Americans. Millions of jobs and trillions of dollars have been taken out of our economy, Senate Majority Leader Chuck Schumer said on the Senate floor on Tuesday. He said the bill is designed to finish the job, to patch up the holes in our economy and lay a foundation for our recovery. Schumer will need the support of all 48 Democrats and the 2 independents who caucus with them, as well as Vice President Kamala Harris' tie-breaking vote to pass the measure before some jobless benefits expire on March 14. 3 centrist House of Representatives members, Democrats Josh Gottheimer and Abigail Spanberger and Republican Tom Reed on Tuesday urged congressional leadership to devote $45 billion to help local communities connect to the internet. They want the money to come out of the $350 billion for state and local aid included in the bill. Their argument is that those with poor or no broadband access are stymied in accessing medical services, including registering for vaccines, and getting their children plugged into remote learning during the pandemic. A Senate aide familiar with negotiations said there also were discussions of tightening income qualifications for people receiving the $1,400 direct payments. Moderate Democratic Senator Joe Manchin said he wants the House's $400 per week temporary federal unemployment benefit reduced to $300. The Senate aide said there also were moves to turn the spigot off on the payments as state jobless rates sink below a certain threshold. Democratic Senator John Tester, following a conversation he and other senators had with Biden on Monday, told reporters, "We talked about the package and we talked about some, how would you put it, targeting dollars. Once the Senate finishes the bill, possibly by the end of this week, the House would then have to sign off one last time before sending it to Biden for enacting into law." House Majority Leader Steny Hoyer said that final vote would come next week. Ivanka Trump short-circuited by her brother Donald Trump Jr. New dynamics within the clan. Once considered the worthy political heir to her father, Ivanka Trump seems to have been bypassed by her brother, Donald Trump Jr. Widely highlighted by the 45th President of the United States in recent weeks, reports CNN. "I'll be back somehow. On January 20th, Donald Trump promised during his farewell speech at the White House to return to the front of the stage. A statement that, in the general opinion, opened the voice to his favorite daughter, Ivanka Trump, who has never made a secret of her ambitions. And yet, it seems that the young woman was bypassed by her brother, Donald Trump Jr., as reported by CNN this Thursday, February 25. In recent weeks, and as Ivanka Trump devotes herself full-time to her family life, the former U.S. president is betting everything on Donald Trump, who has the advantage of being highly regarded by Republicans. A beautiful revenge for the one who has long been considered the ugly duckling of the family, and whom historian Douglas Brinkley now qualifies as the sole presidential heir, as reported by Le Figaro last November. For several weeks now, Donald Trump seems to be betting everything on his son, Donald Trump Jr.'s Zuma Press best image. Ivanka Trump doesn't want anything to do with politics anymore. For her part, Ivanka Trump wants to distance herself from politics, but also from her father, of which she has been the advisor for the past 4 years. She doesn't want anything to do with politics, reveals one of her friends. And to clarify that the wife of Jared Kushner wants to focus on her children, her only goal at the moment. Considered an outcast in New York, where she grew up, is in Florida that the ambitious Ivanka is now trying to improve her image, while waiting for the storm to pass. U.S. Supreme Court leans toward upholding Republican-backed voting curbs. Washington, U.S. Supreme Court justices on Tuesday appeared inclined to uphold 2 Republican-backed voting restrictions in Arizona in a case that could further weaken the Voting Rights Act, a landmark 1965 federal law that bars racial discrimination in voting. During nearly 2 hours of oral arguments by teleconference, the court's conservative justices, who hold a 6-3 majority, asked questions that suggested they could make it easier for states to defend voting restrictions. But it remained unclear how far they would raise the bar to prove violations under the Voting Rights Act. The important voting rights case was heard by the justices at a time when Republicans in numerous states are pursuing new restrictions. After former President Donald Trump made false claims of widespread fraud in the November 3rd election that he lost to Democratic President Joe Biden. Republican proponents of Arizona's restrictions cite the need to combat voting fraud. The justices heard arguments and appeals by Arizona's Republican Attorney General Mark Brnovich and the state Republican Party of a lower court ruling that found that the voting restrictions at issue disproportionately burdened Black, Hispanic, and Native American voters. One of the measures made it a crime to provide another person's completed early ballot to election officials, with the exception of family members or caregivers. The other disqualified ballots cast in person at a precinct other than the one to which a voter has been assigned. Community activists sometimes engage in ballot collection to facilitate voting and increase voter turnout. The practice, which critics call ballot harvesting, is legal in most states, with varying limitations. Voting rights advocates said voters sometimes inadvertently cast ballots at the wrong precinct, with the assigned polling place sometimes not the one closest to a voter's home. Some of the conservative justices noted that the voting curbs at issue are either common in other states or address voting practices amenable to fraud. But much of the argument focused on the proper standard by which courts can still remedy discrimination in voting. Conservative Chief Justice John Roberts pushed back on Michael Carvin, one of the lawyers defending Arizona's measures, who said that it is not a state's role to maximize the voting participation of minorities when considering a voting regulation. Is it maximizing participation or equalizing it? In other words, that only comes up when you have disparate results. And why should there be disparate results if you can avoid them? Roberts asked. Liberal Justice Sonia Sotomayor noted that a lower court that previously ruled in the case found no meaningful threat that ballot collection leads to fraud. A broad ruling by the High Court endorsing the restrictions could impair the Voting Rights Act by making it harder to prove violations. A ruling is due by the end of June. Liberal justices probed Carvin on the dividing line between what kinds of restrictions are acceptable and which ones are not. Carvin conceded to Liberal Justice Elena Kagan that a rule that would require Black voters to travel to country clubs to vote would likely be unlawful. But Carvin indicated that restricting voting hours to the traditional business day would be lawful even if there was evidence that minority voters would face greater difficulties in voting. Carvin also admitted that the out-of-precinct ballot disqualification policy helps Republicans. At issue is the Voting Rights Act Section 2, which bans any rule that results in voting discrimination on account of race or color. This provision has been the main tool used to show that voting curbs discriminate against minorities since the Supreme Court in 2013 gutted another section of the statute that determined which states with a history of racial discrimination needed federal approval to change voting laws. Quite obvious burdens. Kagan noted that some voting restrictions are more of an imposition on voters than others, signaling her interest in the precedent the court could set in the Arizona case that would affect challenges to future laws that may be more restrictive. There are some things that are really quite obvious burdens which you just know by looking at them is going to lead to real difficulty for Black voters or for Native American voters or for Latino voters and other restrictions where you can say, well, that's kind of an inconvenience, but they could overcome that inconvenience if they really wanted to, Kagan said. During the argument, Roberts said it has been widely noted that voter fraud is most likely to occur when the ballot collection practice is used. Conservative Justice Samuel Alito told a lawyer opposing the Arizona restrictions, "What concerns me is that your position is going to make every voting rule vulnerable to attack under Section 2. The Democratic National Committee and the Arizona Democratic Party sued to try to overturn Arizona's restrictions. The San Francisco-based 9th U.S. Circuit Court of Appeals last year found that the restrictions violated the Voting Rights Act, though they remained in effect for the November 3 election. Biden defeated Trump in Arizona. The 9th Circuit also found that false, race-based claims of ballot collection fraud were used to convince Arizona legislators to enact that restriction with discriminatory intent, violating the U.S. Constitution's prohibition on denying voting rights based on race. No evidence U.S. Capitol rioters belong to Antifa movement, FBI Chief Wray testifies. Washington, FBI Director Chris Wray on Tuesday debunked conspiracy theories promoted by right-wing supporters of former President Donald Trump, saying there was no evidence that leftist extremists disguised themselves as Trump supporters to storm the U.S. Capitol. In testimony to the U.S. Senate Judiciary Committee, Wray also told lawmakers that the Federal Bureau of Investigation views the actions of the rioters on January 6 as domestic terrorism and vowed to hold them accountable. We have not to date seen any evidence of any anarchist violent extremists or people subscribing to Antifa in connection with the 6th, he testified, referring to the loosely organized anti-fascist movement. That doesn't mean we're not looking and will continue to look, but at the moment, we have not seen that. Tuesday was Wray's first testimony in Congress since the attack, a failed bid to block Congress from certifying Democrat Joe Biden's November election victory. The attack occurred immediately after Republican Trump, in a speech near the White House, exhorted his supporters to march to the Capitol, having repeated his false claims that the election was stolen from him. The Justice Department has charged more than 300 people with crimes ranging from conspiracy to attacking police and obstructing Congress. The rioting left 5 dead. At least 18 people associated with the far-right Proud Boys have been charged and 9 people tied to the anti-government militia known as the Oath Keepers are facing charges they conspired as far back as November to storm the Capitol to prevent Biden from becoming president. Biden took office on January 20. Wray revealed that since the attacks, the FBI has also seen instances of foreign adversaries who had been leveraging the events of January 6 to amplify their own narratives and push propaganda. He did not provide further details, saying he could not do so in an unclassified setting. Supporters of Trump have repeatedly made unsubstantiated claims the rioters were actually fake Trump supporters who belong to Antifa. They have also repeated Trump's false claims that the election was stolen due to widespread fraud. Wray told lawmakers on Tuesday this narrative was false. To the contrary, he said, a number of the rioters belonged to far-right militia movements or were motivated by racial ideologies, but none to date appear to belong to any left-wing groups. The anti-government militia extremists, he noted, appears to be the biggest bucket that is trending as the FBI examines the backgrounds of the rioters. Wray said he stood by comments made by former Attorney General Bill Barr, who had infuriated Trump after the election when he said the Justice Department did not have evidence of any widespread election fraud. We are not aware of any widespread evidence of voter fraud, much less that would have affected the outcome of the presidential election, Wray told lawmakers. The FBI has yet to arrest any suspects in the death of Capitol Police Officer Brian Sicknick, or for pipe bombs that were discovered outside the headquarters of both the Republican and Democratic National Committees. The FBI has obtained a video that shows a suspect spraying bear spray on police officers, including Sicknick, according to a law enforcement source familiar with the investigation. The suspect has yet to be identified by name, and it is still unclear if the bear spray contributed to Sicknick's death. Wray said he cannot disclose a cause of death, and Sicknick's death is still under investigation. In a newly unsealed search warrant, investigators say rioters carried weapons inside the Capitol, including tire irons, sledgehammers, tasers, bear spray and, in at least one case, a handgun with an extended magazine. Investigators including the FBI have come under scrutiny over why more was not done to protect the Capitol ahead of the attack. The day before, the FBI's Norfolk, Virginia office distributed a raw, unverified intelligence report which warned that violent extremists intended to disrupt Congress. Wray told lawmakers the intelligence was shared with other law enforcement agencies 3 different ways, but acknowledged he personally did not see the report until a few days later. As to why other top law enforcement officials did not see it, Wray said, "I don't have a good answer to that." Senator Richard Blumenthal, a Democrat, said to Wray, "What I don't understand is why this raw intelligence didn't prompt a stronger warning and alarm." The governor of New York weakened by the accusations of a third woman. Will the powerful governor of New York be forced to resign? More than 3 years after #MeToo, pressure is mounting after a third woman accuses Andrew Cuomo of inappropriate behavior. For a week, the situation has been getting worse every day for this 63-year-old governor, son of a governor, ex-minister of the Clinton government and friend of Joe Biden. Became a star of the management of the pandemic in 2020, to the point that some were pushing him to run for the White House. Already in the hot seat for having minimized, perhaps deliberately, the number of deaths from COVID in retirement homes in this state of 20 million inhabitants. Mr. Cuomo has since Wednesday been implicated by 3 women, much younger than him. Former economic advisor Lindsey Boylan, 36, said on Wednesday the governor had unsolicited her kiss on the mouth and suggested that she play strip poker with him when she worked with him between 2015 and 2018. On Saturday, another ex-collaborator, Charlotte Bennett, 25, said the governor had made advances that made her uneasy in the spring of 2020. And on Monday night, a third woman, who has never worked with him, told the New York Times he shocked her by wanting to kiss her against her will at a wedding in 2019. The newspaper published a photo showing the governor holding her by the cheeks, visibly scared. His accusers are calling for his resignation, as are a growing number of elected New Yorkers, Republicans, but also Democrats like him. A demonstration is also planned in New York on Tuesday evening, although it is not known whether it will be very popular. The new testimony makes it much harder to stay in office, said Sam Abrams, professor of political science at Sarah Lawrence College. Polarization rather than #MeToo. But this one of the most powerful governors in the United States, who has ruled New York State for 10 years and whose third term expires at the end of 2022, is not one to resign. He is a fighter and can still clear his name if a misunderstanding is credible. But if he loses his party's support, which seems to be happening, he will not be able to run for a 4th term, Abrams added. So far, Democratic Party leaders in New York and Washington have not let go, simply calling for an independent investigation into the allegations. Mr. Cuomo, a former prosecutor, eventually agreed to hand her over to the toughest state attorney, Letitia James. The latter said Monday that the investigation report would be made public, without specifying when. To force Cuomo to resign, the Parliament of New York would be required to initiate impeachment proceedings against him, similar to those that exist at the federal level to impeach a president, with a simple majority in the lower house and 2/3 in the Senate. Such a scenario seems unlikely, according to several analysts, especially since after 4 years of Trump's presidency and ultra-polarization, party affiliations have taken hold, especially on #MeToo when it comes to supporting an elected official or not, according to Michael Miller, political scientist at Barnard University. Even though the Democrats, and especially the left wing of the party, want to be an exemplary party in terms of conduct, many refuse to be bound by principles that Republicans disregard, he said. He cites the recent example of Republican Senator Ted Cruz, although he deserted his state of Texas, devastated by an extremely rare cold spell, for the Mexican resort of Cancun. Calls for his resignation were not followed. Effect. If this scandal had erupted a few years ago, Democrats would have no choice but to call for Cuomo's resignation. But things have happened since then, said Michelle Goldberg, columnist for the New York Times. After the protests that followed George Floyd's death in May 2020, the culture war has shifted to issues of race, she says. And Democrats have never digested the forced resignation of popular Senator Al Franken in 2018, in the midst of the #MeToo wave, accused of inappropriate gestures on several women, she said. Yet even if he escapes resignation or impeachment, many believe Mr. Cuomo's political career is coming to an end. It's reasonable to assume this is his last governorship, and his last year in public service, Miller said. Nicolas Sarkozy denounces a deep injustice. Former French President Nicolas Sarkozy denounces a deep injustice after his sentencing to prison, and does not rule out going before the European Court of Human Rights, ECHR, so that the law and the law triumph. Justice. In an interview with Le Figaro posted online Tuesday, I have felt the deep, shocking injustice of the procedures launched against me for 10 years, he affirms daily. By assuring to have preserved its determination so that the triumph of the law and justice, as it should occur in a state of law. Each time these rules are flouted, as is the case in this case, my indignation and my determination are increased tenfold. Proclaims the former head of state, sentenced Monday to 3 years in prison, including one firm for corruption and influence peddling in the so-called eavesdropping case, an unprecedented judgment in France. I cannot indeed accept to have been condemned for what I did not do, affirms Mr. Sarkozy, denouncing a judgment full of inconsistencies and which does not mention evidence, but a bundle of clues. Referring to a long-term fight, he recalls having appealed against the judgment. But perhaps this fight will have to end before the European Court of Human Rights, ECHR. It would be painful for me to have my own country condemned, but I am ready because that would be the price of democracy, he adds. Withdrawn from politics since 2016, but still very popular and very listened to on the right, a year before the next presidential election, Nicolas Sarkozy is under strong judicial pressure. He is implicated in several cases, including that of suspicion of Libyan financing of his victorious 2007 campaign. It was in the context of the latter case that he was wiretapped in 2013. The judges then discovered that he was using a secret telephone line, opened under the alias of Paul Bismuth, to communicate with his lawyer Thierry Herzog. The judges considered that the former president was guilty of corruption by promising to support the candidacy of a high magistrate, Gilbert Azibert, for a prestigious position in Monaco, in exchange for privileged information, or even influence on a cassation appeal that he lodged. The former tenant of the Élysée then wanted to cancel the seizure of his presidential agendas after having obtained a dismissal in another file, the Betancourt affair. Gilbert Azibert, general counsel in a civil chamber, did not intervene directly in this case, but according to the court he played on his relations. During the trial, the defense protested against a case based on fantasies and hypotheses, arguing that Nicolas Sarkozy did not succeed before the High Court and that Gilbert Azibert never had a post in Monaco. The Dominican Republic wants to build a wall of separation with Haiti. The Dominican Republic has announced the construction of a border fence to reduce illegal immigration from its neighbor Haiti. A controversial project whose effectiveness raises doubts if it is not accompanied by development plans, underline several experts. Within 2 years we want to put an end to the serious problems of illegal immigration, drug trafficking and transit of stolen vehicles that we have known for years, said President Luis Abinader, elected in July 2020, announcing on Saturday the launch in the second half of construction work for a 380-kilometer border fence. An Israeli weapons company, Rafael Advanced Defense Systems, is designing a pilot project. This should include a double fence in the most sensitive parts and a simple fence for the rest. In addition to motion detectors, facial recognition cameras and radar and infrared systems, added the head of state without revealing the cost. 4 official crossing points separate the two countries which share the island of Hispaniola, of which 64% of the territory is occupied by the Dominican Republic, 10 million inhabitants, to the west, and the rest by Haiti, 11 million of inhabitants. Relations between the two countries are historically difficult, and each new Dominican government makes the sensitive issue of migration a priority. About 500,000 Haitians live illegally across the border, and Domingo soldiers patrol areas where illegal immigration and smuggling crosses. This proposed wall follows an agreement reached on January 14 between Luis Abinader and his Haitian counterpart, Jovenel Moïse, to reduce the irregular migratory flow and strengthen border security and surveillance. But Juan del Rosario, professor at the Autonomous University of Santo Domingo, believes that this wall has no reason to exist because as long as extreme poverty and political instability persist in Haiti, there will be migratory pressure. You can build a wall 100 meters high, people will always look for ways to pass, said the researcher to AFP, citing the wall wanted by former President Donald Trump between the United States and Mexico. However, with more financial and technological means, this turned out to be impossible to achieve, he notes. Unnecessary expenditure. Although it is not unanimous, this physical border project is well received in the streets of Santo Domingo. There are Haitians everywhere, we can't even make an appointment with the doctor because it's full of Haitians. So for me the wall is a good idea, says Lucia, a 23-year-old student, who refused to give her last name. This will reduce the problems, adds Antonio Mejia, 62, unemployed. Would make it possible to control migration from one country to another. William Charpentier, coordinator of the Dominican National Office for Migration and Refugees, regrets that each time, the idea of erecting a border wall exacerbates xenophobia and racism. He points to the massive expulsions of illegal immigrants and the obstacles that legal migrants encounter in renewing their papers or renting a home. This is permanent persecution, he laments. Experts also underline the numerous trade exchanges at the borders. Contrary to what one might think, on the Haitian side there is the money and on the Dominican side the product, explains Professor Juan del Rosario. There is a constant informal exchange that cannot be considered contraband. If it is blocked, it will lead to internal migratory flows from border towns to urban areas, he warns. In addition, sectors such as agriculture and construction need foreign labor, explains Josue Gastelbando, head of the mission of the International Organization for Migration, IOM, in Santo Domingo. Measures such as strengthening border controls should ideally be complemented by measures to promote regular and orderly migration, he stresses. For William Charpentier, building this long separation represents unnecessary expenses. According to him, it would be more opportune to multiply development projects in the border area, which would benefit both Dominicans and Haitians. Blinken speaks with Ethiopian leader about human rights concerns in Tigray. Secretary of State Antony Blinken on Tuesday spoke with Ethiopia's Prime Minister to express concerns over escalating violence and human rights violations in the country's Tigray region and offer U.S. assistance to help resolve the conflict. Blinken urged Prime Minister Abiy Ahmed to take immediate, concrete steps to protect civilians, including refugees, and to prevent further violence, State Department spokesperson Ned Price said in a statement. Secretary Blinken also asked that the government of Ethiopia work with the international community to facilitate independent, international, and credible investigations into reported human rights abuses and violations and to hold those responsible accountable. The Secretary also reiterated calls for the immediate withdrawal from Tigray of Eritrean forces and forces from the region of Amhara in northwest Ethiopia, according to Price. Ethiopia's foreign ministry did not immediately respond to a request for comment. Earlier this week, Ethiopia criticized Blinken for seeking a withdrawal of outside forces from Tigray. It should be clear that such matters are the sole responsibility of the Ethiopian government, Ethiopia's foreign ministry said in the statement issued Sunday, according to the Associated Press. The statement added that no foreign country should try to dictate a sovereign nation's internal affairs. Ethiopian federal forces in recent weeks have routed Tigray opposition figures from the region that in November sought to put its own leaders in regional government positions, against the wishes of the central government in the capital Addis Ababa. Abiy, who was awarded the Nobel Peace Prize in 2019 for reaching a peace agreement with neighboring Eritrea after 16 years of war, has come under international scrutiny for his government's actions in Tigray. The United Nations recently said that the humanitarian situation in Tigray is critical amid intensified fighting, with nearly 100,000 displaced and 1.3 million people in need of aid because of the conflict. The conflict has drawn international concern over the fate of vulnerable civilians and refugees, as well as condemnation over reported atrocities. Last week, Amnesty International and the Associated Press published new findings that Eritrean forces, allied with the Ethiopian army, instituted a brutal massacre in the Tigray city of Aksum in late November, considered one of the holiest cities in Ethiopian Orthodox Christianity. Amnesty International said in the report that many hundreds were killed in the city by the Eritrean army that engaged in widespread looting and extrajudicial killings, deliberately and wantonly shooting at civilians during the worst of the violence. The AP estimated that between 300 and 800 people were likely killed, and that bodies lay in the streets for days as Eritrean forces barred residents from collecting their loved ones. Linda Thomas-Greenfield, the new U.S. ambassador to the United Nations, said the U.S. would raise the issue of alleviating humanitarian concerns in Ethiopia this month under its leadership of the UN Security Council. Representative Michael McCall, Republican Texas, the ranking member of the House Foreign Affairs Committee, also responded to the massacre reports, calling for decisive action by the Biden administration to hold those accountable for any atrocities committed. The horrors detailed in the reports coming out of the Tigray region are incredibly concerning, and I am looking into them further, he said in a statement last week. For far too long, the government of Ethiopia and other armed actors have blocked access by journalists and independent monitors to investigate these chilling accounts. I urge the Biden administration to take decisive action to hold those accountable for any atrocities committed. China says door to Xinjiang always open, but UN rights boss should not prejudge. Geneva, China said on Tuesday that it was discussing a visit to its Xinjiang region by United Nations Human Rights Chief Michelle Bachelet, but that she should not set out with the aim of condemning its policies. Bachelet said on Friday that reports about arbitrary detention, ill treatment, sexual violence and forced labor in Xinjiang necessitated a thorough and independent assessment of the situation. The door to Xinjiang is always open, and we welcome the High Commissioner to visit Xinjiang. Communication is kept up between the two sides, but the aim of the visit is to provide exchanges and cooperation rather than so-called investigation based on guilty before proven, China's delegate Zhang Duan told the UN Human Rights Council. China opposed the politicization of human rights and interference in its internal affairs, he said, also rejecting concerns raised by Australia, Sweden and the United States at the Geneva Forum. We also find it regrettable the High Commissioner made unsubstantiated accusations against China based on misinformation and political pressure, said Zhang. People of all ethnic groups in Xinjiang and the Tibetan region enjoy wide-ranging freedoms, including religious and cultural harmony, he said. Bachelet said on Friday that she hoped to clinch agreement with Chinese officials about a visit. Louise Arbour was the last UN High Commissioner for Human Rights to visit China, in September 2005. Activists remain skeptical about the prospects for a meaningful visit with unfettered access in China. Sophie Richardson, China Director for Human Rights Watch, said in a tweet on Tuesday #China statement that the aim of the #Xinjiang visit is to provide exchanges and cooperation says it all, doesn't it? That door is firmly closed. Sarah Brooks of the International Service for Human Rights said, after more than 2 years of spinning their wheels on a visit, the High Commissioner and her team and the governments at the Human Rights Council need to shift gears to take decisive action. Beijing dismisses alleged Chinese hacking of Indian vaccine makers. Beijing, New Delhi, China on Tuesday rejected an allegation by a cyber intelligence firm that a state-backed hacking group targeted the IT systems of 2 Indian coronavirus vaccine makers. CIFIRMA told Reuters that hacking group APT-10, known as Stone Panda, had identified gaps and vulnerabilities in the IT infrastructure and supply chain software of Bharat Biotech and the Serum Institute of India, SII, the world's largest vaccine maker. Without showing any evidence, the relevant party made baseless speculation, distorted and concocted facts to malign a specific party, China's foreign ministry told Reuters. This behavior is irresponsible and has ulterior motive. China firmly opposes it, it added in a written reply to questions about CIFIRMA's allegations. Asked to respond to Beijing's comment, CIFIRMA, a company which is backed by investors including Goldman Sachs, said in a statement, "We stand by our findings and research." STU declined to comment. Bharat Biotech, which said on Monday it did not comment on hacking-related matters, had no immediate comment on Tuesday. The Office of the Director General of the state-run Indian Computer Emergency Response Team, CERT, told Reuters on Monday the hacking matter had been handed to its operations director. It declined further comment. STU is making the Oxford University AstraZeneca vaccine for many countries and will soon start bulk manufacturing Novavax shots, while Bharat Biotech plans to export its Covaxin shot to dozens of countries, including Brazil and the Philippines. China and India have both sold or gifted COVID-19 shots to many countries. India produces more than 60% of all vaccines sold in the world. Relations between the nuclear-armed neighbors soured in June when 20 Indian and 4 Chinese soldiers were killed in a Himalayan border confrontation. Recent talks have eased tension, and the Chinese Foreign Ministry said both sides were working towards safeguarding the peace in the border region. China and India are using military diplomatic channel to communicate about how to properly manage the border situation, the Foreign Ministry statement said. We hope everyone can work together to stop the spreading of fake information, it added. Exclusive. Venezuelan intelligence monitored Citgo executives in U.S. court testimony. Caracas, Venezuelan intelligence services monitored 6 U.S.-based executives of state-owned refiner Citgo Petroleum for a year on U.S. soil to determine their involvement in a deal the government deemed fraudulent, leading to their 2017 arrest in Caracas on corruption charges, according to court testimony. The executives, known as the Citgo Six, were sentenced by a Venezuelan court in November to between 8 and 13 years in prison for corruption in a procedure the U.S. State Department labeled a kangaroo court. 5 of the men are naturalized U.S. citizens. The trial documents reviewed by Reuters include testimony provided by a senior Venezuelan military official, Ramon Balza, about the monitoring. The testimony has not been previously reported. Balza, who was serving in 2017 as Director of Operations for Venezuela's Military Counterintelligence Directorate, SEAM, said intelligence services send information collected over the course of a year to Public Prosecutor Tariq William Saab, whose office used it to open a criminal investigation. Reuters was unable to contact Balza. The SEAM did not respond to a request for comment. Saab's office and Venezuela's Information Ministry also declined to respond to questions from Reuters. Ever since that company Citgo became Venezuelan, the company and its board members have been monitored by this country's intelligence services, Balza said in August 11 testimony at a Caracas appeals court. Balza, who conducted the arrests, signed a criminal investigation report entered into evidence at the trial and reviewed by Reuters. The document stated the 6 men signed a July 2017 refinancing contract by Citgo that prosecutors alleged was unfavorable to Venezuela's interests. When asked by a defense attorney for one of the men how he obtained the information, Balza said intelligence services had telephony and things that follow these people, without providing specific details. That is how intelligence agencies function, he said. Everyone knows that and every country does it. The United States brands Venezuelan President Nicolas Maduro a dictator and has imposed sanctions on state oil company Petróleos de Venezuela, PDVSA. It has also indicted senior Venezuelan officials on charges of corruption and drug trafficking. In December, it imposed sanctions on the judge and prosecutor in the Citgo case, saying that media and rights groups were denied access to the trials. Benjamin Dinh, deputy director of the Wilson Center's Latin America program and a former South America director at the White House National Security Council, said any violation of U.S. laws by Venezuelan intelligence services could provide an opportunity for Washington to crack down. If they're violating U.S. laws, then they're justifiably at risk of U.S. prosecution, and we're always looking for excuses to investigate members of this regime, Dinh said. U.S. federal law prohibits wiretapping of telephone calls without a warrant and requires any non-diplomatic foreign agents to register with the Department of Justice, according to Stephen Cash, counsel at the Day Pitney law firm and a former prosecutor. If they were intercepting and wiretapping in the United States, that would be a crime, Cash said. It was not clear from the testimony if Venezuelan intelligence services violated either of those laws. The Department of Justice declined to comment on whether the monitoring would trigger any action. U.S. intelligence services also routinely gather human intelligence on countries where the United States has strategic interests, 4 former CIA officers. The trial documents show that defense attorneys repeatedly said the prosecution presented no evidence linking the Citgo executives, José Pereira, José Luis Zambrano, Hilario José Zambrano, Jorge Toledo, Tomeu Vidal and Gustavo Cardenas to the refinancing transaction. Once we heard Balza confessed what they did, we requested a mistrial and a criminal investigation against those responsible, a defense attorney for Vidal said in a statement. Referring to both the intelligence services monitoring and testimony by Balza that the men were arrested before a warrant was issued by a court, potentially violating their right to due process. Defense attorneys for the other detainees declined to comment. Political currency. The men are widely viewed by U.S. analysts and U.S. officials as potential bargaining chips for Venezuela to extract concessions from the United States. Last month, Maduro alleged the men were CIA agents, without providing evidence, and excluded the possibility of their release as a concession to the administration of President Joe Biden. Maduro's latest allegation is nothing but a callous attempt to leverage the lives of American citizens as political currency, a State Department spokesperson said at the time. In the testimony, Balza and Rafael Franco, who in 2017 served as the regime's special director for criminal investigations, said military counterintelligence detained the Citgo 6 on orders from prosecutors even though the regime was not in physical possession of a warrant. However, Balza and Franco gave divergent testimony on the crucial question of whether a judge had approved a warrant before the men were arrested, without which the detentions potentially would have been illegal. Balza said prosecutors requested an arrest warrant from a judge after the group was detained. Franco testified that the prosecutor who instructed him to detain the men said a judge had issued an arrest warrant already, even though the regime had not yet received it. Franco was the regime official responsible for liaising with the judicial system but did not carry out the arrests himself. Reuters was unable to reach Franco for comment. In his testimony, Balza said the regime believed the 6 men were due to fly out of Venezuela that afternoon. What we did was detain them preventatively, without it rising to the level of illegal detention, Balza said in his testimony. Magali Vasquez, a Venezuelan criminal procedure expert at Andrés Bello Catholic University, said Venezuelan law would allow officers to detain suspects on orders from prosecutors in cases of exceptional need and urgency if an arrest warrant already exists, and the prosecutor informed officers of the warrant. Detaining suspects before such a warrant exists would be illegal, she said. Washington imposed sanctions on Franco in July 2019 for alleged involvement in the torture and death of Venezuelan Navy Captain Rafael Acosta Arevalo. U.S. understanding is Myanmar ambassador to UN remains in position, State Department. Washington, the U.S. State Department spokesman Ned Price on Tuesday said that the United States' understanding is that Myanmar's ambassador to the United Nations in New York, Cho Mo Tun, remains in position despite an attempt by the junta to install his deputy. Myanmar state television announced on Saturday that Chomo Tun had been fired for betraying the country, a day after he urged countries to use any means necessary to reverse a February 1 coup that ousted the nation's elected leader Aung San Suu Kyi. Kuwait reappoints oil, finance ministers in new cabinet. Kuwait's Emir Sheikh Nawaf Al Ahmad Al Sabah issued a decree on Tuesday approving a new cabinet that reappointed the oil and finance ministers, the state news agency Kuna said. The previous government had resigned in January in a standoff with parliament that had posed the first big political challenge to the emir since he assumed power last September at a time the OPEC member state is facing a liquidity crunch. Oil Minister Mohammed Abdulatif Al Fairs, Finance Minister Khalifa Hamid and Foreign Minister Sheikh Ahmad Nasser Al Sabah were reappointed in the new cabinet. The previous government's resignation came after more than 30 members of parliament in the 50-seat assembly supported a motion to question Prime Minister Sheikh Sabah Al-Khalid Al-Sabah on various issues, including his choice of ministers. Since being reappointed on January 24 as premier, a post Sheikh Sabah has held since late 2019, he has held consultations with parliamentary blocs. The coming period requires cooperation with the legislative authority, and the meetings brought points of view closer together, Kuna quoted Sheikh Sabah as saying. He stressed the need for agreeing a package of legislation, resolving some political files and uniting efforts to tackle financial and administrative corruption whether inside or outside the government apparatus, it added. A key priority is overcoming legislative gridlock on debt legislation that would allow Kuwait to tap international markets to tackle the liquidity crunch caused by low oil prices and COVID-19. Lawmakers opposed to the bill have called for clarity on government plans to reduce reliance on oil exports. Frequent rows and deadlocks between the appointed cabinet and elected assembly have led to successive government reshuffles and dissolutions of parliament over decades, hampering investment in economic and fiscal reform. Emir Sheikh Nawaf, who has final say in state matters, last month issued a decree suspending parliament sessions for 1 month as of February 18. Kuwait has the most vibrant political system among Gulf Arab states, with a parliament able to pass and block legislation and question ministers. Senior government posts are occupied by members of Kuwait's ruling family. Kuwaiti opposition figures made gains in last year's parliamentary polls. Some have proposed electoral reforms and a pardon for dissidents, many in self-exile, to the new emir. Sarkozy says he is ready to sue France before European court to prove innocence. Paris. Former French President Nicolas Sarkozy said on Tuesday he was ready to go all the way to the European Court of Human Rights to prove his innocence, his first public reaction after being found guilty of corruption by judges on Monday. I appealed the decision. Maybe will I have to pursue this fight all the way to the European Court of Human Rights, Sarkozy told Le Figaro newspaper in an interview. That would be painful for me to have to get my own country condemned, but I'm ready for it because that would be the price of democracy, he said, adding he would not run for president in 2022 but will endorse a candidate in due time. Myanmar's neighbors press junta for Suu Kyi's release, restoration of democracy. Some of Myanmar's neighbors pressed its ruling junta on Tuesday to release ousted leader Aung San Suu Kyi and cease using lethal force against opponents of their February 1 coup to work out a solution to the crisis. The calls from fellow members of the Association of Southeast Asian Nations, ASEAN, came as Myanmar police again opened fire to disperse crowds after weeks of demonstrations against military rule. Several people were wounded, witnesses said. ASEAN foreign ministers held talks with a representative of the junta in a video call 2 days after the bloodiest day of unrest since the military overthrew Suu Kyi's elected government. At least 21 people have been killed since the coup, which Singapore Prime Minister Lee Hsien Loong said in an interview with the BBC was a tragic step back for Myanmar. The foreign minister of Indonesia, which has been pushing a regional diplomatic effort, urged Myanmar to open its doors to the ASEAN bloc to resolve the escalating tension, but said there was little it could do if it did not. Retno Marsudi called for the release of political detainees and for the restoration of democracy, while pledging that ASEAN countries would not break their pledge of not interfering in each other's affairs. Restoring democracy back on track must be pursued, Retno said. Indonesia underlines that the will, the interest and the voices of the people of Myanmar must be respected. The foreign ministers of Malaysia and the Philippines also called for the release of Suu Kyi. But some countries were less emphatic, and a statement from the group said all parties should refrain from instigating violence, and that ASEAN stood ready to help. ASEAN groups Myanmar, Singapore, the Philippines, Indonesia, Thailand, Laos, Cambodia, Malaysia, Brunei, and Vietnam. The bloc's effort to engage with Myanmar's military has been criticized by supporters of democracy, with a committee of ousted Myanmar lawmakers declaring the junta a terrorist group and saying ASEAN's engagement would give it legitimacy. Sasa, a senior member of the committee who has been anointed as its representative to the United Nations, said ASEAN should have no dealings with this illegitimate military-led regime. Myanmar's own representative to the United Nations denounced the coup last week, and after the junta announced he had been fired, he staked a formal claim as the legitimate representative, according to letters seen by Reuters. Condemnation. The coup halted Myanmar's tentative steps towards democracy after nearly 50 years of military rule and has drawn condemnation and sanctions from the United States and other Western countries. Singapore's Lee said sanctions would not affect the junta but hurt the people, and the way forward was to free Suu Kyi and work out a solution, describing the takeover as an enormous tragic step back. To use lethal force against civilians and unarmed demonstrators, I think it is just not acceptable. That is disastrous not just internationally, but disastrous domestically, said. Hundreds of protesters, many wearing hard hats and clutching makeshift shields, gathered earlier behind barricades in different parts of Myanmar's main city of Yangon to chant slogans before police moved in, firing stun grenades. There were no reports of injuries in Yangon, but 4 people were wounded in the northwestern town of Kale, where police fired live ammunition to disperse a crowd after protesters threw objects at advancing police, witnesses said. State television MRTV later said security forces used stun grenades, rubber bullets and other non-lethal measures. They were acting like they were in a war zone, a teacher at the protest who declined to be identified said of the police. MRTV said that crowds were being instigated through social media by illegal organizations and causing instability. It said 12 riotous protesters had been detained in Yangon. After the use of force by security forces on the streets, people protested from their balconies after dark across Yangon, chanting the revolution must succeed and calls for Suu Kyi's health. The military justified the coup, saying its complaints of fraud in a November election won by Suu Kyi's party were ignored. The Election Commission said the vote was fair. Junta leader Senior General Min Aung Hlaing has pledged to hold new elections and hand power to the winner but has given no time frame. Suu Kyi, 75, appeared at a court hearing via video conferencing on Monday and looked in good health, one of her lawyers said. 2 more charges were added to those filed against her after the coup, the lawyer said. More than 1,100 people have been detained, according to activists, among them 6 journalists in Yangon, one of whom works for the Associated Press, which has called for his release. Don't forget to comment below with your common sense and subscribe to your podcast. This helps bring the podcast to life and grow it. You can follow us on Instagram, Twitter, Facebook. We can't wait to continue this adventure with you. Support us on PayPal. Thank you very much and enjoy listening.